I'm analyzing and discussing David Deutsch's book, The Beginning of Infinity. This is part 6. In the previous 2 parts, we talked about induction. So one of the ideas of induction is you can extract theories from experience. This is problematic, as I explained, because experience is infinitely ambiguous. However, it's easy to extract some theories. The hard part is not coming up with some sort of theory that is compatible with experience. The hard part is figuring out which theories are any good. So inductivists say to find the theory that has the best fit with the data, that's most strongly supported by the data, but that vague concept doesn't really work. Data either contradicts a theory or it doesn't. Attempts have been made to define some sort of degree of support, but they haven't worked. And we don't need them. We don't need that. Criticizing ideas, finding flaws, is an adequate method to explain and support all of our learning, all of our science, etc. So moving on, BOI starts talking about Justificationism. One of the really old ideas, which Popper talked about too, is that knowledge is justified true belief. And this is something that Popper, David, and I all disagree with. And you can disagree with all 3 words. BOI here focuses on what's wrong with justified, but the other words are also problematic. If you say knowledge is only true ideas, then basically we never have knowledge because none of our ideas are perfect. They have some sort of flaws or they're wrong in some way. But the fact that they're wrong in some way doesn't mean that they aren't also right in some way. Knowledge means that they're right in some way. They're getting something right. They don't have to be perfect to qualify as knowledge. So they don't actually have to be true. You can be wrong, but still be partly right, and it's still knowledge. Belief is problematic as well. You can have knowledge in a book, but books do not have beliefs. So what about justified? Justified means designated as true, or at least probable, by reference to some authoritative source or touchstone of knowledge. That's a quote from the book. It's right around here. So David says the problem is they're changing the question from how do we know, which is a reasonable question, to by what authority do we claim, which is a problematic question. It's seeking an authoritative answer rather than seeking critical thinking. The answer to how do we know, that question is a little bit problematic because it cries out for a positive answer, like here's how I prove my case. But you could still answer it with how do we know? We know because we've used critical analysis, we've done critical thinking, we've tested it, we've looked for flaws and haven't been able to find any. And if someone says, well, that's not going to prove you're right, your answer is, of course it doesn't. It's just the best knowledge that I have. And it's possible we'll learn something new in the future. But when the question is by what authority do we claim, there's no good answer. We should not be looking to use authority. Whether it is a feeling of certainty or a endorsement like popularity or it's our senses, or a particular method like induction, or critical rationalism, which also should not be an authority. You shouldn't say, well, I use critical rationalism, therefore I'm probably right. You can make mistakes, and that applies no matter what method you're using. So the next paragraph goes on to talk about Fallablism. David says, Fallablism is, there are no authoritative sources of knowledge. He presents it as the opposing position to Justificationism. I think that's confusing because fallible means capable of error. It's also defined in more dictionaries as likely to err. They often use the word liable to error, which means basically likely to make an error. But the capable of error definition is the one that I prefer. It's the one that I know David prefers, and that's how you would normally think about Fallablism. It's not saying you're likely to make an error, it's saying you could make an error. It doesn't say how likely it is, it's just it's possible, there's no guarantees against it. That's the, the standard strict meaning of Fallablism as we see it. Also, on the topic of Fallablism, we do think errors are common. So you shouldn't just say, technically I could be wrong. You should say, being wrong is pretty common, so it's something I should be worried about in general. I should, in general, be looking for my errors and trying to correct them as a standard part of life, not a technicality. So in that sense, it fits the likely to err definition pretty well, because we think errors are reasonably common or likely. So the paragraph goes on to say, it's Fallablism, not mere rejection of authority, that is essential. And that's a little odd, because you define Fallablism as the opposing position to Justificationism, which meant using authority. And he said it means no authoritative source of knowledge, so basically no authority. Then he said we need something more than no authority, which I agree with. It's just the two things clash a bit. So what more do we need? So if we know we're capable of error, then that implies or suggests or hints or something. A reasonable person could react to it and say, therefore, we need to correct our errors. It's essential that we're looking for and fixing errors, not just rejecting authority. If we have ideas that did not come from authority, and then we don't look for any problems with them, that's not going to work very well either. So many justificationists today are Fallablists. I'm not sure if they always have been or not, but it's very common today that they're into probability. I don't often talk to people who think they can guarantee that they're right about most issues. A lot of people are mixed. So they think, some people think that they can say 2 + 2 is 4, and that's infallible. It's 100% guaranteed, could not possibly be wrong. But then for most of their ideas, they do not think it's infallible. They think they have fallible justifications, supporting arguments that are not a guarantee but are pretty good. And then there are some people who I think are a little bit more reasonable, who don't think they have a 100% guarantee about anything, including 2 + 2 = 4. So they say they have very, very strong good arguments for that, and they're very, very confident in it, but their confidence is not literally 100%. But they're still a justificationist. So what is the key idea of justificationism as I see it? It's trying to positively support ideas. And as David was saying, the way that you positively support ideas always turns out to be authority. People have all kinds of ways they present it, but when you get down to the essentials and you figure out what's really going on there, why do they think that works, what's going on, it's some sort of authority. There's never really like a good reason. It's always just kind of this particular way of getting ideas arbitrarily is deemed to be really good. Or even not arbitrarily, maybe because of some arguments. So Popper talked about positive and negative arguments quite a bit. I mean, part of what he said was that justification was about making positive arguments, but actually we need to make negative arguments, critical arguments. So we can't support why we're right, but we can find errors and point them out and then come up with new ideas that don't have those errors. So as I see it, justificationism is not about rejecting Fallablism. It's not an opposite to Fallablism. In fact, it can be a way of dealing with Fallablism. People say, well, we might make mistakes. That's scary. What can we do about it? They're trying to deal with this problem that error is possible. And their answer is, we'll try to prove that we're right. We'll try to justify our ideas and build them up. Not necessarily as a guarantee against error, but at least a partial guarantee against error to make it less likely that we're wrong. We're trying to reduce this risk. So Fallablism is this problem to be addressed, and they want to reduce the risk of being wrong with their positive arguments. So the critical rationalist position is different. It says we should focus more on progress, and that we should be willing to find and fix errors instead of focusing so much on prevention. So we cannot prevent all our errors, or even most of them, in advance, making sure they never happen by doing things in the right way or with the right authorities or whatever else. We need to put a significant portion of our effort into looking for errors in the ideas we already have and fixing them, not just avoiding them in the first place. You can't avoid all your errors. That's a thing BOI says elsewhere. So the logic of justificationism is to look for ways of securing ideas against change. We're trying to prove they're right. So we're actually working against changing them and improving them. It's anti-progress in a way. We're trying to make it so when we first come out with our idea, version 1, it's as hard to change as possible. It's as hard to find errors in, which is partly a good thing, but you can also see the problem. So you shouldn't focus too much on that. Instead, you should put a lot of attention into correcting misconceptions and trying to come up with better ideas and change things for the better. So, another way of explaining this. David has similar ideas, but not exactly like this. So justificationists think we'll be wrong less if we support our ideas with something that indicates that they're awesome. So the more we demonstrate our ideas are awesome, the more confidence we can have. But that doesn't work. You cannot demonstrate that ideas are awesome. That's the idea of positive support, or justification, which Popper criticized. What we can do instead is criticize ideas, and we can tentatively accept ideas if we can't find anything wrong with them. The best we can do for an idea is we can't find anything wrong with it. We don't know of any errors. We've looked, we've tried to test it, we've done experimental tests or whatever else is appropriate. We've tried to criticize it, we've brainstormed criticisms, etc. We've asked people who disagree with us for reasons and what they think and so on. And if we cannot find anything wrong with the idea, then we say, okay, I'm going to accept this idea, I'm going to act on it. David has actually complained about the idea of accepting ideas. I'm not entirely sure what his point is there. Sometimes we act on ideas. Sometimes we make a decision. And we're like, okay, I'm going to go ahead and get on with my life and take some sort of action because of this idea. Like, I think physics works a certain way, so I'm going to put this satellite into orbit to do GPS. And if I'm wrong about physics, then the satellite might not work correctly. Both in terms of the GPS stuff and the orbit and the launch and so on. But so at some point you actually go ahead and build and launch your satellite. So you've made a decision, you've accepted some theories, is what I would say. And then acted on them. As opposed to, there's like a prior phase where you're just pondering it. You're like, oh, I have an idea about how maybe orbits and GPS and so on work, but I'm not really that confident yet, and I'm still thinking about it and looking for criticism. And at some point, you decide to actually go ahead and act on the theory. So there's the earlier phase where you're thinking about it, and the later phase where you've made a decision. So it goes from an active point of inquiry that I'm currently focusing attention on trying to improve to it is now something that I think maybe I know, but I'm always open to revision. Like in the future, I might revisit it. If someone points out a problem, if something goes wrong, if I just have some sort of inspiration and think of a reason to revisit it, then I could always reconsider. So ideas change from the status of currently being considered to not actively being considered, but open to reconsideration. So I call that accepting ideas. And following Popper, I call it tentative, meaning it's open to change. It's not permanent. It's not set in stone. Anyway, so the main point here is the critical rationalist view is you cannot prove you're right. You cannot have positive arguments that show you're right or likely to be right. Instead, you have, I couldn't find anything wrong with this, and that's the best you can do. And that's what all of our science is actually based on and how it works. And the rival view is justificationism, the idea that we can show how awesome our ideas are in some sort of with positive arguments that support them. So one of the things that's hard about reading BOI is there are a lot of topics, and it'll do a few paragraphs that are really dense and have a lot of information in them, which is why it's taking a bunch of videos to get very far in the book. And then it'll switch to another one, and it doesn't have section headings. Maybe there are some somewhere, I forgot for sure, but in general there aren't. Like, we're switching a topic partially right now without some sort of heading to organize it. And there's, in my opinion, there's not quite enough text to help you relate the topics together and put them all together. There's some of that, but there could be a bit more. That's one of the things I'm trying to help with. So we have a bit of a topic shift here, but it is related. It's still connected. So the broad overall theme that the book has been talking about is empiricism, and topics like induction and Fallablism and Justificationism were brought up in connection with empiricism and how we know about reality and use our senses and stuff. So David says empiricists have downplayed the value of guesses and of our own thoughts. And they've thought that our senses don't have errors, or some people would say are less likely to have errors, maybe. Or that those errors are not avoidable. There's nothing you can do if your senses have errors. And therefore, error comes from adding to or subtracting from or misinterpreting what our senses say or what any other authoritative source of knowledge says, like the Bible, perhaps. The idea here is that these authorities are either perfect or the best we can do, and then our own thoughts introduce error. And so the way to deal with fallibilism is don't think too much so that you don't make many mistakes. This is not a good approach. It's very different than critical rationalism. So the concept there is basically the point of an authority is it's less fallible. So if you change anything, you're now adding or applying your own full fallibility. So what you need to do is try not to change or alter or think too much about or interpret anything from authorities, including your senses. So that is a bad approach. Do not do that. This related idea here, it's a mistake to theorize before one has data, is a bit different. Because the mistake earlier in the paragraph was it's a mistake to theorize at all. And here it's a mistake to theorize before data. You can theorize after data. So we disagree with both. You need theories before data in order to interpret the theories, which is what David says at the beginning of the next paragraph. As Popper says, all our observations are theory-laden. So recap. Justification is about positive support. And how do you positively support a thing? It turns out, if you analyze each attempt, there's always some sort of authority involved. Fallablisim is about capability of error, and also error is common and something we should be looking out for and trying to deal with. We should reject authority. We should try to correct our errors and make progress. And thinking does not raise the risk of making a mistake. We're always thinking it's unavoidable. You can't just trust authorities and try not to think to avoid errors. So if you want part 7, hit subscribe, click the bell, click all. It also helps if you like and comment and share this.